Mother Bear refused to leave ICU after bringing injured child. Everyone was in tears. The mountain air carried a strange heaviness that October evening, the kind that made Ethan Marshall pause at the glass door of his veterinary clinic. He stood there for a moment, his tired eyes scanning the darkening forest line that bordered the parking lot. The clinic sat at the edge of Cedar Ridge, a small mountain town where the wilderness pressed close enough that you could hear wolves howling on quiet nights. Ethan had been running this place for 15 years now, treating everything from domestic pets to the occasional injured wildlife that Good Samaritans brought in. But tonight felt different somehow. The usual evening chorus of birds had gone silent, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. He shook his head at his own imagination and turned the lock on the front door, ready to head home after another long day of surgeries and checkups. That's when he saw her. At first, his mind couldn't quite process what his eyes were seeing. A massive shape moved through the shadows at the edge of the parking lot. Too large to be a dog, too deliberate in its movement to be just passing through. As the figure emerged into the pale yellow glow of the clinic's outdoor lights, Ethan's blood ran cold. It was a bear. Not just any bear, but a full-grown mother grizzly, her dark fur rippling with each powerful step. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to back away from the door, to find somewhere safe to hide, to call for help. But something made him stay frozen in place, his hand still on the door handle, his eyes locked on the approaching animal. The bear moved with purpose, but there was something in her gait that seemed wrong. She wasn't charging or displaying any of the aggressive behaviors he'd learned about in his wildlife training courses. Instead, she moved slowly, almost carefully, as if she was carrying something precious. As she got closer, Ethan could see that she was indeed carrying something in her mouth, something that hung limp and small against her massive frame. The bear stopped about 10 feet from the door, and for the first time in his life, Ethan found himself looking directly into the eyes of a wild grizzly bear. What he saw there made his breath catch in his throat. Those eyes weren't filled with the blank wildness he expected. Instead, they held something that looked impossibly like desperation, like a plea that transcended the boundary between species. The bear gently lowered her head and placed what she had been carrying on the ground. It was a cub, small and motionless, its fur matted with what looked like blood. The mother nudged the little form with her nose, a gesture so tender that Ethan felt his heart constrict. Then she looked back up at him, and in that moment, something passed between them that he would never be able to fully explain. She took a step back from the cub, then another, her eyes never leaving his face. She was asking him something. No, she was begging him. This massive predator, capable of killing him with a single swipe of her paw, was standing before him in complete vulnerability, asking for help. Ethan's rational mind screamed at him about protocols, about safety, about the sheer insanity of what he was considering. You don't open doors for wild bears. You especially don't open doors for mother bears with cubs. It went against every piece of training, every safety guideline, every ounce of common sense. But his hands were already moving, slowly reaching for the door handle. The bear watched him, perfectly still now, as if she understood that any sudden movement might break whatever fragile understanding had formed between them. Ethan pushed the door open, just wide enough for him to step out. The cool mountain air hit his face, carrying the wild scent of the bear, earthy and powerful. He moved slowly, each step deliberate and careful, his eyes moving between the mother and the injured cub. The little one was breathing, but barely. Ethan could see a deep gash along its side, probably from a fall or an encounter with another predator. The wound needed immediate attention. He looked back at the mother bear, who had retreated another few steps but was watching intently. "I need to take him inside," Ethan heard himself say, his voice barely above a whisper. It was absurd talking to a bear, but somehow it felt necessary. "I need to help him, but I have to take him inside." The bear made no move, just continued to watch with those impossibly intelligent eyes. Taking this as permission, Ethan carefully gathered the small cub into his arms. It weighed maybe 20 pounds, its body limp but warm. As he stood, cradling the injured animal, he expected the mother to react, to charge, to reclaim her baby. But she didn't. She just watched as he slowly backed toward the door. What happened next would be burned into Ethan's memory forever. As he reached the threshold of the clinic, the mother bear began to follow. Not aggressively, not threateningly, but with the same careful deliberation she had shown from the beginning. She was following her cub, and she was trusting him, a human, with her most precious thing in the world. Ethan's mind raced as he entered the clinic. He couldn't let a wild bear into his veterinary hospital. It was beyond dangerous. It was absolutely insane. But as he looked down at the small, injured form in his arms, and then back at the mother standing just outside the door, her massive frame silhouetted against the darkness, he made a decision that would change everything. "Okay," he whispered, more to himself than to her. "Okay, you can come in, but you have to stay calm." The words sounded ridiculous even as he said them, but the bear seemed to understand something in his tone. She moved forward slowly, her massive paws silent on the tile floor of the clinic's entrance. Ethan backed up, giving her space, his heart pounding. So hard he was sure she could hear it. The automatic lights flickered on as they moved deeper into the clinic, illuminating the sterile white walls and medical equipment. The bear's presence in this human space was surreal, like something out of a dream or a fairy tale. She was too large, too wild, too impossible for this place of domesticated medicine. Ethan laid the cub on the examination table in the main treatment room, his hands already reaching for supplies even as his mind struggled to process what was happening. The mother bear found a corner of the room and settled down, her eyes never leaving her cub. She didn't explore or investigate, she just watched with an intensity that was both heartbreaking and terrifying. As Ethan began to clean the wound, he found himself talking, partly to calm his own nerves and partly because the silence felt too heavy. "It's a deep cut," he said, his voice steadier now that he was focused on the medical task at hand. "But I think I can help him. He's lost some blood, but his vital signs are stable." The bear made a low sound, not quite a growl, more like a rumble of acknowledgement. Ethan's hands worked automatically, years of training taking over. He cleaned the wound, applied antibiotics, and began to stitch the gash closed. All the while, he was acutely aware of the mother's presence, of her watching every movement he made. Several times, when the cub whimpered in pain, she would shift slightly, and Ethan would freeze, waiting to see if she would intervene. But she never did. She seemed to understand that he was helping, that the pain was necessary for healing. As he worked, Ethan found himself stealing glances at the mother bear. In the bright lights of the treatment room, he could see details he'd never noticed in his previous, distant encounters with bears. The way her fur had different shades of brown and black, creating patterns unique as fingerprints. The small scars on her muzzle that told stories of survival in the wilderness. The way her breathing was deep and steady, despite what must have been incredible stress. There was something almost meditative about her stillness, as if she had made her decision to trust and was now simply waiting, believing that her faith would be rewarded. The stitching took nearly an hour. Ethan had to be extra careful working with the thick fur and tough skin of the young bear. He administered antibiotics and pain medication, calculating the doses carefully for the cub's weight. Through it all, the mother watched. When he finally finished, stepping back from the table with exhaustion pulling at his shoulders, she made that low rumbling sound again. The cub was breathing more easily now, the wound cleaned and closed, an IV drip providing fluids and medication. "He needs to stay overnight," Ethan said, again speaking to the bear as if she could understand every word. "Maybe a few nights. The wound was deep and there's always a risk of infection." The bear's response was to settle more firmly into her corner, her message clear. She wasn't going anywhere. Ethan stood there for a moment, looking between the sedated cub on his table and the massive predator in his clinic, and wondered how his life had taken such an impossible turn. He thought about calling someone, but who would believe him? And more importantly, what if they wanted to tranquilize the bear, to remove her by force? Something told him that would be wrong, that this trust she had shown deserved to be honored, no matter how unconventional the situation. He moved to his desk in the corner of the room, pulling out the chair slowly so as not to startle the bear. She watched him but made no aggressive moves. Ethan sat down and began to write notes about the cub's treatment, his hand shaking slightly as the adrenaline began to wear off. Every few minutes, he would look up to confirm that, yes, there was indeed a wild grizzly bear sitting in his clinic, watching over her injured cub. The situation was so far beyond anything in his experience that he felt like he was moving through a dream. As the hours passed, something strange began to happen. The terror that had initially gripped Ethan began to fade, replaced by a different kind of awareness. The bear's presence, while still overwhelming, no longer felt threatening. She was just a mother, worried about her child. The fact that she was a different species seemed less important than that fundamental truth. He found himself thinking about his own mother, how she had sat by his bedside when he'd been sick as a child, refusing to leave even when the nurses told her visiting hours were over. The parallel was impossible to ignore. Around midnight, Ethan heard a car pull into the parking lot. His night technician, Jessica Brooks, was arriving for her shift. He'd completely forgotten she was scheduled to come in to monitor some post-operative pets. Panic flared in his chest as he heard her key in the lock. "Jessica, wait!" he called out, but it was too late. She was already pushing through the door, humming softly to herself. She made it 3 steps into the treatment room before she saw the bear. The scream that started to build in her throat died as quickly as it began, choked off by pure shock. "Don't move," Ethan said quietly, though the bear had shown no sign of aggression at Jessica's entrance. "Just don't make any sudden movements." Jessica stood frozen in the doorway, her eyes wide, her face pale. She looked from the bear to Ethan to the cub on the table, trying to process what she was seeing. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice barely audible, Is that a bear in our clinic?" He nodded slowly. "She brought her injured cub. She came to us for help." The words sounded insane even as he said them, but what else could he say? It was the truth, impossible as it seemed. Jessica's eyes moved to the cub on the table, taking in the IV line, the neat stitches, the steady rise and fall of its small chest. Her medical training kicked in, and Ethan could see her assessing the situation with professional eyes. "How bad was it?" she asked, her voice a bit steadier. "Deep laceration to the lateral thorax," Ethan replied, falling back on medical terminology to ground himself in something familiar. "No organ damage, but significant blood loss. I've sutured the wound and started him on antibiotics and fluids." The bear watched this exchange with what seemed like interest, her head moving slightly to look at Jessica. The young woman took a careful step forward, then another. "She's not aggressive?" Jessica asked. Ethan shook his head. "She's just watching. She's been like this for hours. I think she understands we're helping." Jessica moved to the table, her movements slow and deliberate. She checked the cub's vitals, adjusted the IV drip, her hands steady despite the surreal situation. The bear watched but didn't interfere. "This is impossible," Jessica whispered, but there was wonder in her voice now, not just fear. "Bears don't do this. They don't seek out human help. They don't—" She trailed off, looking at the mother bear with something approaching awe. "But she did," Ethan said simply. "She brought him here, and she's trusting us." They stood there in silence for a moment, two humans and a bear, united in their concern for the small life on the table. As the night wore on, Jessica and Ethan took turns monitoring the cub while keeping a respectful distance from the mother. They spoke in hushed tones, afraid to break whatever spell had allowed this impossible situation to occur. The bear dozed occasionally, but never fully slept, always alert to any change in her cub's condition. When the little one would stir or whimper, she would make soft sounds, almost like she was trying to comfort him from across the room. Around 3 a.m, the cub began to wake from the sedation. His eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, then sharpening as he became aware of his surroundings. He made a small sound, somewhere between a whine and a cry, and his mother was instantly alert. She rose from her corner, and both Ethan and Jessica tensed. But the bear moved slowly, carefully approaching the table. She was so tall that she could easily see her cub without rising on her hind legs. She leaned in close, her massive head gentle as she sniffed her baby, checking him over with a thoroughness that was remarkably similar to how a human parent might examine an injured child. The cub responded to his mother's presence, his sounds becoming less distressed. The bear made soft huffing noises, and incredibly the cub seemed to calm. She looked at Ethan then, those intelligent eyes holding his gaze for a long moment before she returned to her corner. The message was clear. She approved of what they had done, but her vigil wasn't over. The cub needed more time to heal, and she would wait. "We should call someone," Jessica said quietly. "Fish and Wildlife, maybe. This can't be legal." Ethan had been thinking the same thing, but something held him back. What if they tranquilize her? Take her away from her cub? After the trust she's shown? Jessica bit her lip, clearly torn between protocol and the extraordinary situation before them. But we can't just have a wild bear in the clinic. What happens when morning comes, when other staff arrive, when clients start showing up? These were all valid concerns, and Ethan didn't have good answers for any of them. All he knew was that something remarkable was happening, something that transcended normal procedures and regulations. This bear had done something that challenged everything they thought they knew about wild animals. She had recognized the clinic as a place of healing, had overcome every instinct to avoid humans, had placed her most precious possession in their care. How could they betray that trust by calling in authorities who might not understand? "Let's just get through tonight," Ethan said finally. "We'll figure out the rest in the morning." Jessica nodded, though he could see she wasn't entirely convinced. They continued their vigil, checking on the cub regularly, maintaining the IV drip, monitoring his vitals. The bear watched everything, learning their routines, understanding on some level that all of this activity was for her baby's benefit. As dawn began to break through the windows, painting the white walls of the clinic in soft pink and gold, Ethan felt the weight of exhaustion pulling at him. He'd been up for nearly 24 hours, and the emotional toll of the night's events was catching up with him. But he couldn't leave, Not while this incredible situation was still unfolding. The cub was stable now, breathing easily, his wound showing no signs of infection. With proper care, he would make a full recovery. The morning light seemed to change something in the room's atmosphere. What had felt dreamlike and surreal in the darkness now seemed even more impossible in the light of day. There was a grizzly bear in his veterinary clinic. She had been there all night, peaceful and trusting, watching as they cared for her cub. Ethan looked at the bear, really looked at her, and noticed something he hadn't seen before. There was a small scar above her left eye, old and well-healed, but distinctive. Something about it nagged at him, like a memory just out of reach. Jessica was preparing another round of antibiotics for the cub when they heard another car in the parking lot. They both froze, looking at each other with sudden panic. It was Dr. Logan Carter, the clinic's senior veterinarian, arriving for his morning shift. He was a good man, but very by the book, and there was no way he would accept a wild bear in the clinic, no matter the circumstances. "What do we do?" Jessica whispered urgently. Before Ethan could answer, they heard Logan's key in the lock. The bear's ears perked up at the sound, her body tensing slightly. She could sense their anxiety, and it was making her nervous. Ethan stood slowly, moving toward the door of the treatment room. Maybe he could intercept Logan, explain the situation before he saw, but it was too late. Logan was already in the hallway, calling out a cheerful good morning. He walked into the treatment room, coffee in hand, and stopped so abruptly that the hot liquid sloshed over the rim of his cup. The room was absolutely silent for what felt like an eternity. Logan's eyes moved from the bear to Ethan, to Jessica, to the cub on the table, his mouth opening and closing without sound. The bear watched him, her body coiled with tension, but not yet aggressive. Finally, Logan found his voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "Ethan, there's a bear in our clinic. There's a grizzly bear in our clinic." His voice rose slightly on the last words, hysteria creeping in. "Logan, I can explain," Ethan started, but Logan was already backing toward the door. No. We need to call someone. Animal control, fish and wildlife, someone. This is dangerous, this is insane, this is—" He stopped mid-sentence because the bear had moved. Not aggressively, but she had shifted her position, placing herself more directly between Logan and her cub. The message was clear. She saw him as a potential threat. "Logan, please," Ethan said, keeping his voice calm and steady. "Just listen. She brought her injured cub here. She came to us for help. She's been peaceful all night, hasn't shown any aggression. Look at the cub, Logan. Look what we've done." Despite his fear, Logan's eyes moved to the examination table. His medical training kicked in as he observed the neat sutures, the properly placed IV, the stable vital signs on the monitor. "You treated a bear cub," he said slowly, with its mother in the room. "She let us," Jessica said, speaking up for the first time. "She understood we were helping. She's been watching all night and she hasn't made a single aggressive move. Logan, this is extraordinary." Logan stood there, coffee still dripping from his cup onto the floor, trying to process what he was seeing and hearing. The bear had settled back into her watching position, though her eyes remained fixed on the newcomer. "This is still illegal," Logan said, but his voice had lost some of its panic. "We can't have a wild animal in the clinic. If something happens, if she attacks someone, we could lose everything, the liability alone." But even as he spoke, Ethan could see him being drawn in by the impossibility of the situation, by the undeniable fact that a wild bear had sought out human help and was peacefully coexisting with them in this space. "One more day," Ethan said. The cub needs at least one more day of observation and antibiotics. Then they can go. Logan looked at him like he'd lost his mind. You want to keep a grizzly bear in our clinic for another day? What about our appointments? What about the other animals? What about basic safety? These were all reasonable questions, and Ethan didn't have good answers for any of them. All he had was a deep conviction that what was happening here was important, that it deserved to be seen through to its conclusion. The bear made a sound then, a soft huffing noise that drew everyone's attention. She was looking at her cub, who was stirring again, becoming more alert. The little one tried to lift his head, making small sounds of distress. His mother responded with gentle vocalizations, and amazingly, the cub settled. It was such a human moment, a mother comforting her child, that all three humans stood transfixed. "My God," Logan whispered. She's just a mother." The fear in his voice had been replaced by something else, something like wonder. He took a tentative step forward, then another. The bear watched him but didn't react aggressively. "The wound looks good," he said, his professional instincts taking over. "No signs of infection. Good suture work, Ethan." They stood there, three veterinarians and a wild bear, united in their concern for the small patient on the table. The morning sun streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes in the air, creating an almost magical atmosphere. It felt like they were standing at the intersection of two worlds, the wild and the civilized, and for this brief moment, those worlds were overlapping peacefully. "We need a plan," Logan said finally, his practical nature asserting itself. "We can't just wing this. If we're going to keep them here, we need to do it safely and sensibly." Ethan felt a wave of relief. Logan was on board, or at least willing to consider it. They began to discuss logistics, how to manage the clinic's schedule, how to ensure safety, how to continue treating the cub while respecting the mother's presence. As they talked, the bear seemed to relax slightly. She could perhaps sense that the new human was not a threat, that he too was interested in helping her cub. She settled more comfortably into her corner, though her watchful gaze never left her baby. The cub was more alert now, his eyes bright and curious as he looked around the strange environment. He made small movements, testing his body, and while he winced at the pull of the stitches, he seemed stronger than he had just hours before. Jessica prepared another dose of antibiotics, approaching the table slowly. The mother bear watched intently but didn't interfere, as Jessica administered the medication through the IV port. "He's doing well," she announced. "His temperature is normal. Heart rate is good. The wound is already starting to show signs of healing." The bear made that soft rumbling sound again, almost like she understood and approved of the report. As the morning progressed, they developed a routine. One person would monitor the cub while the others handled the absolutely necessary tasks of the clinic. They canceled all non-emergency appointments, telling clients there was a situation at the clinic that required all their attention. It wasn't exactly a lie, though it certainly didn't capture the full, extraordinary truth of what was happening. Logan took charge of organizing things, his initial fear replaced by a kind of determined fascination. He set up barriers to keep other staff from accidentally entering the treatment room, put signs on the doors, and fielded phone calls with carefully vague explanations. Meanwhile, Ethan and Jessica continued to care for the cub, maintaining his IV fluids, monitoring his vitals, and watching for any signs of complications. The little bear was proving to be a good patient, seeming to understand that the humans were helping him. He would watch them with bright, curious eyes, and occasionally make soft sounds that his mother would answer from across the room. The communication between mother and cub was constant and gentle, a reminder that they were witnessing something profound about the bonds between parent and child, regardless of species. Around midday, something remarkable happened. The cub, feeling stronger, tried to stand on the examination table. His legs were shaky, and the movement clearly pulled at his stitches, but he was determined. His mother immediately stood up, moving closer to the table, her eyes intense with concern. Ethan and Jessica stepped back, unsure how she would react to her cub's distress, but, instead of becoming aggressive, the mother bear did something extraordinary. She placed her massive paw gently on the edge of the table, not touching her cub, but close enough that he could smell her, could feel her presence. She made soft, encouraging sounds, and slowly, carefully, the cub managed to stand. It was a small victory, but everyone in the room felt its significance. The cub was healing, getting stronger. He stood there for maybe 30 seconds before his legs began to tremble, and Jessica quickly stepped forward to help him lie back down. The mother bear watched this intervention without aggression, seeming to understand that the human was helping her baby. She returned to her corner, but there was something different in her posture now, something that looked almost like relief. As afternoon approached, word had somehow begun to spread through the small mountain community. Ethan wasn't sure how. Perhaps someone had seen the bear entering the clinic the night before, or maybe one of the staff members had let something slip. But people began gathering in the parking lot, keeping a respectful distance but clearly curious about what was happening inside. Logan was nervous about the attention, worried about liability and safety, but Ethan found himself thinking that maybe this was important. Maybe people needed to see that such connections between humans and wild animals were possible. Through the window, Ethan could see faces pressed against car windows, children being lifted up by their parents to get a better view of the clinic where something magical was happening. Thought about the story they would tell, about the bear who brought her baby to the humans for help. It sounded like something out of a fairy tale, but it was real, happening right here in their small mountain town. The cub continued to improve throughout the day. His appetite returned, and Jessica was able to give him some specialized formula through a bottle, the mother bear watching approvingly as her baby fed. The wound showed excellent signs of healing, with no infection or complications. By late afternoon, Ethan was confident that the cub would make a full recovery. The question now was, what would happen next? How would this extraordinary episode end? As the sun began to set on the second day, painting the mountains in brilliant oranges and purples, the three veterinarians found themselves once again standing watch over their unusual patients. The bear had been in the clinic for over 24 hours now, a testament to her trust and desperation. She looked tired, the stress of the situation clearly wearing on her, but she remained steady in her vigil. "We should probably start thinking about release," Logan said quietly. "The cub is stable enough to continue recovering in the wild, and we can't keep them here indefinitely." Ethan knew he was right, but something in him resisted the idea. This experience had been so profound, so outside the realm of normal life, that he didn't want it to end. But of course it had to. The bear and her cub belonged in the wild, not in a veterinary clinic. "Tomorrow morning," Ethan suggested, "we'll give him one more night of antibiotics and observation, then release them at first light." The others agreed, and they began to make preparations. They would need to remove the IV, give the cub a final dose of long-acting antibiotics, and figure out how to safely transport them back to the forest. It would be the final chapter in this incredible story. As night fell again, the clinic grew quiet. Most of the crowd had dispersed, though a few dedicated watchers remained in the parking lot. Inside, the atmosphere was peaceful, almost contemplative. The cub was sleeping soundly, his breathing deep and regular. His mother dozed in her corner, though she would periodically open her eyes to check on her baby. Ethan sat at his desk, trying to write up some kind of report about what had happened, though he knew no official document could capture the true magnitude of these events. Jessica was preparing the final round of medications when she suddenly gasped, "Ethan, look at this!" She was holding an old file, one she'd pulled from the archive room. Remember, about 10 years ago, that orphaned cub that was brought in? The one that had been hit by a car? Ethan moved to look at the file, his heart beginning to race. There were photos of a small bear cub, injured and scared, being treated in this very clinic. And there, above the cub's left eye, was a distinctive wound that would leave a scar. He looked from the photo to the mother bear in the corner, at the healed scar above her left eye, and felt his world tilt on its axis. "It's her," he whispered. "She was here before. We saved her when she was a cub, and now—" He couldn't finish the sentence, too overwhelmed by the implications. This bear had remembered. After 10 years in the wild, she had remembered this place, these people who had helped her, and in her hour of desperate need, she had brought her own cub here. The revelation changed everything. This wasn't just a random encounter between wild and civilized worlds. This was a deliberate choice based on memory and trust. This bear had carried the knowledge of human kindness with her for a decade, and when her own baby was hurt, she had made the extraordinary decision to seek out that kindness again. Ethan felt tears prick at his eyes as he looked at the bear with new understanding. She wasn't just any bear. She was their bear, one they had saved years ago, now grown and with a family of her own. He showed the file to Logan and Jessica, watching as the same awe and understanding dawned on their faces. They all turned to look at the bear, who was watching them with those intelligent eyes. Did she recognize them specifically, or just the place? It was impossible to know, but the connection was undeniable. They had saved her, and now they were saving her cub. It was a circle of compassion that spanned years and species. The night deepened around them, and one by one, the watchers in the parking lot went home, leaving the clinic in peaceful darkness. Inside, 4 souls kept watch, 3 humans and 1 bear mother, united in their concern for the small life they were protecting. The cub stirred occasionally, making small sounds that his mother would answer with gentle rumbles. Each time, Ethan felt the same wonder at witnessing this intimate communication between parent and child. As midnight approached again, marking the beginning of their 3rd day together, Ethan found himself thinking about the nature of trust. This bear had shown a level of trust that most humans wouldn't be capable of. She had walked into the territory of what should have been her natural enemy, had allowed them to take her injured child, had waited patiently while they did things she couldn't understand, all because somehow she knew they would help. It was humbling and beautiful and completely extraordinary. Jessica had fallen asleep in a chair, exhausted from the long vigil. Logan was dozing at the desk, his head pillowed on his arms. Ethan remained awake, unable to stop watching the bear and her cub. In a few hours they would release them back into the wild. This incredible chapter would close, and life would return to normal. But Ethan knew he would never be the same. None of them would. They had been given a gift, a glimpse into something magical and rare, a reminder that the boundaries between human and animal were not as fixed as they might seem. Chapter 2. The Silent Vigil. The news of what was happening at Cedar Ridge Veterinary Clinic spread through the mountain town like wildfire, though the full truth was so extraordinary that most people only heard fragments and rumors. Some said a bear had attacked the clinic. Others claimed the veterinarians had captured a wild cub. But for those inside the clinic, the reality was far more profound than any rumor could capture. The mother bear's vigil had entered its second full day, and her presence had transformed the sterile medical space into something that felt almost sacred. Jessica Brooks had never experienced anything like it in her 5 years as a veterinary nurse. She stood in the doorway of the treatment room, watching as the massive grizzly maintained her patient watch over the recovering cub. The bear had found a position that allowed her to see both her baby and the door, her dark eyes tracking every movement with an intelligence that continued to astound everyone who witnessed it. There was something deeply moving about the way she sat, her powerful body relaxed but alert, ready to protect but trusting enough not to intervene as the humans continued their care. The morning light streamed through the windows, illuminating the bear's fur in shades of brown and gold. Jessica noticed details she'd never imagined she'd see so close. The way the bear's chest rose and fell with each breath. The small movements of her ears as she listened to the sounds of the clinic. The occasional soft rumble she would make when her cub stirred. It was like being given a window into a world that humans rarely got to see. The private world of wild creatures and their profound emotional bonds. Dr. Logan Carter had called his wife earlier that morning, trying to explain why he wouldn't be home. "There's a bear in the clinic," he had said, and then had to spend 10 minutes convincing her he wasn't joking. Even now, having spent hours in the presence of the bear, he found himself periodically stopping to marvel at the impossibility of it all. He was preparing another round of antibiotics for the cub, his movements slow and deliberate, always aware of the mother's watchful gaze. She had learned their routines quickly, seeming to understand that the syringes and IV bags meant help for her baby, not harm. The cub was doing remarkably well. The wound was healing cleanly, with no signs of infection, and his energy was returning. He would occasionally try to sit up on the examination table, making small sounds of curiosity about his strange surroundings. Each time, his mother would respond with gentle vocalizations, and the cub would settle, reassured by her presence. The communication between them was constant and complex, a language of love that transcended species boundaries. Ethan had been going through the clinic's old records, piecing together more details about the bear's previous visit 10 years ago. She had been just a few months old then, orphaned and badly injured after being struck by a vehicle on the mountain road. The notes, written by Dr. Sarah Winters, who had since retired, described a frightened cub who had gradually learned to trust her human caregivers. There were photos of the young bear taking formula from a bottle, playing with enrichment toys, slowly recovering her strength. The release had been documented too, with notes expressing hope that the cub would successfully reintegrate into the wild. "She not only survived," Ethan said to the others, holding the old file. "She thrived. She grew up, found a mate, had a cub of her own, and when that cub was hurt, she remembered us." His voice was thick with emotion. The implications were staggering. This bear had carried the memory of human kindness for a decade, had somehow understood that this place was a source of healing. It challenged everything they thought they knew about animal memory and cognition. As the morning progressed, more people began arriving in the parking lot. Word had spread beyond Cedar Ridge to neighboring towns, and cars with license plates from across the state were pulling up. Some people had cameras with long lenses, trying to catch a glimpse through the clinic windows. Others simply stood in quiet groups, drawn by the story of the bear who had sought human help. Logan was worried about the attention, but Ethan felt there was something important happening here, something that needed to be witnessed. A knock at the clinic's back door interrupted their thoughts. It was Avery Johnson, a wildlife biologist from the State Department who had heard about the situation. Ethan knew her from previous consultations about injured wildlife, and he trusted her judgment. He let her in through the back entrance, away from the crowd. and led her quietly to the treatment room. Avery stopped in the doorway, her scientific training warring with her amazement at what she was seeing. "This is impossible," she whispered. But she was already pulling out a notebook, her trained eye taking in every detail. Bears don't do this. They just don't. The risk assessment alone, she would have to overcome every instinct. She moved slowly into the room, and the mother bear's eyes tracked her movement. "May I?" Avery asked, gesturing toward the cub. Ethan nodded, and she approached the examination table with careful steps. The mother bear watched intently as Avery examined the cub from a respectful distance, not touching but observing with professional interest. "The wound treatment is excellent," she said, "and the cub's body condition is good. The mother has been taking good care of him." She turned to look at the adult bear, studying her with scientific curiosity. "She's about 12 years old, I'd estimate. Prime breeding age. And that scar—" Ethan showed her the old records, and Avery's eyes widened as she made the connection. "This has implications," Avery said slowly, "for our understanding of bear cognition, memory, problem-solving. This kind of complex decision-making, the ability to remember and trust humans after so many years. It's unprecedented." She was excited by the scientific possibilities, but Ethan could see she was also moved by the simple emotional truth of what was happening. A mother's love had overcome the boundaries between wild and tame, between human and animal. The cub was becoming more active as the day went on, his natural curiosity beginning to assert itself despite his injury. He would look around the room with bright eyes, taking in the strange sights and smells of the human world. When Jessica approached with his bottle of formula, he would make eager sounds, and his mother would rumble approvingly. The feeding process had become a careful dance, with Jessica moving slowly and the mother bear watching every movement, but there was a rhythm to it now, a mutual understanding. "She trusts us," Jessica said after successfully feeding the cub. "I mean, really trusts us. Not just tolerates us, but actually trusts us with her baby." There were tears in her eyes as she said it. The weight of that trust was not lost on any of them. They were being given something precious and rare, a bridge between worlds that usually existed in complete separation. Around noon, a local news van arrived, and Logan's anxiety spiked. "We can't have media here," he said. "This could turn into a circus." But Avery had a different perspective. "This story needs to be told," she argued. "People need to know that these connections are possible. It could change how we think about wildlife, about coexistence." After much debate, they agreed to allow one reporter and one camera operator to briefly document what was happening, with strict conditions about maintaining distance and quiet. The reporter, a young woman named Haley Dawson, who had grown up in Cedar Ridge, entered the clinic with an expression of awe. She had covered many stories in her career, but nothing like this. She spoke in hushed tones as the camera captured the scene. The bear in her corner, maintaining her vigil. The cub on the table, alert and healing. The veterinary staff moving carefully around them, continuing their care. "What we're witnessing here challenges our fundamental assumptions about wild animals," Haley said into the camera. "This mother bear hasn't just tolerated human intervention, she sought it out. She remembered kindness from a decade ago and trusted humans with her most precious possession, her cub." The bear seemed unbothered by the camera, her focus remaining on her baby. She had accepted that this human place, with all its strange sights and sounds and smells, was where her cub needed to be to heal. As the afternoon wore on, the atmosphere in the clinic became almost meditative. The initial shock and fear had long since faded, replaced by a kind of reverent wonder. Even routine tasks took on a different quality when performed in the presence of the bear. When Logan prepared medications, when Jessica checked vitals, when Ethan updated charts, they all moved with a deliberate care that honored the trust being shown to them. The cub had his best moment yet when he managed to stand on all fours on the examination table. His legs were still shaky, and the movement clearly pulled at his healing wound, but he stood proudly for almost a minute. His mother made a sound that could only be described as encouraging, and when he finally lay back down, exhausted from the effort, she rumbled with what seemed like approval. It was such a human moment, a parent proud of their child's small victory, that everyone in the room smiled. Michael Hayes, the clinic's senior technician, had arrived for his shift and, after the initial shock, had thrown himself into helping care for the unusual patients. He had experience with wildlife rehabilitation and brought a calm competence to the situation. "In all my years," he said, preparing a new IV bag, "I've never seen anything like this. The trust, the intelligence, the emotional complexity, it's humbling." He approached the cub slowly, aware of the mother's watchful gaze, and efficiently changed the IV bag. The bear watched but didn't interfere, having learned that these procedures helped her cub. As evening approached, they began to discuss the plan for release. The cub was healing well, and while he would benefit from continued care, it was becoming clear that he was strong enough to recover in the wild. The antibiotics had done their work, the wound was closing nicely, and his energy was returning. But there was a reluctance in everyone to end this extraordinary encounter. They had been given a glimpse into something magical, and none of them wanted it to end. "Tomorrow morning," Ethan said finally, "we'll remove the IV tonight, give him a final dose of long-acting antibiotics, and release them at dawn." The decision felt right, but also heartbreaking. They all looked at the bear, wondering if she somehow understood that their time together was coming to an end. She continued her patient vigil, those intelligent eyes moving between her cub and the humans who had become, temporarily, part of her world. The crowd outside had grown throughout the day, with people bringing their children to witness what many were calling a miracle. Parents held their kids up to see through the windows, telling them about the brave bear who had trusted humans to help her baby. Some people had been there for hours, drawn by something they couldn't quite articulate. It wasn't just curiosity, it was a hunger for proof that the divide between human and nature wasn't as absolute as they had believed. As the sun began to set, painting the mountains in brilliant colors, the clinic took on an almost magical quality. The golden light streamed through the windows, illuminating the bear's fur and making the cub's eyes shine. Jessica found herself thinking about all the walls humans built between themselves and the natural world, and how this one bear had simply walked through them all, carrying nothing but trust and desperate love for her child. The local news story had been picked up by national outlets, and Ethan's phone hadn't stopped ringing. Everyone wanted more information, more footage, more access to this incredible story. But he ignored most of the calls, feeling protective of what was happening here. This wasn't just a news story, it was something sacred, something that deserved a respect and reverence, not exploitation. Dr. Sarah Winters, the retired veterinarian who had treated the bear as a cub 10 years ago, arrived at the clinic just as the sun was setting. Ethan had called her earlier, and she had driven 2 hours to see for herself. When she entered the treatment room and saw the adult bear, tears immediately sprang to her eyes. "My little one," she whispered, "you survived. You grew up." The bear looked at her, and for a moment Ethan could have sworn he saw recognition in those dark eyes. Sarah approached slowly, her movements careful but confident. She had spent weeks with this bear when she was a cub, bottle-feeding her, treating her injuries, preparing her for release. "I always wondered," she said softly, what became of you, whether you made it. And here you are, a mother yourself, still trusting us after all these years." The emotion in the room was palpable, as everyone witnessed this reunion between the old veterinarian and the bear she had saved so long ago. The cub chose that moment to make a particularly loud vocalization, drawing everyone's attention. He was sitting up on the table, looking much stronger than he had even hours before. His eyes were bright and curious, and when his mother rumbled at him, he responded with a series of small sounds that almost seemed conversational. The exchange between mother and cub continued for several minutes, a dialogue that none of the humans could understand, but all could feel the meaning of: reassurance, love, and the promise that soon they would return to their world. As night fell, the clinic grew quiet again. Most of the crowd had dispersed, though a few dedicated watchers remained. Inside, the atmosphere was peaceful, but tinged with the melancholy of an impending goodbye. They all knew that what they were experiencing was temporary, a brief intersection of two worlds that would soon separate again. The bear seemed more relaxed than she had been since arriving, perhaps sensing that her cub was truly healing, that her desperate gamble had paid off. Jessica prepared the final medications while Michael and Logan discussed the logistics of the release. They would need to do it early, before the crowds returned, somewhere safe where the bears could disappear back into the wilderness. Avery had suggested a location she knew, a clearing about 5 miles up the mountain road where bears were often seen. It was far enough from human habitation, but close enough to where the mother had likely come from. Ethan sat with Sarah, listening as she told stories about the bear's cubhood, how she had been terrified at first, huddled in the corner of a cage, refusing to eat, how gradually, with patience and gentleness, she had learned to trust, how she had eventually played with toys, splashed in a water tub, and even seemed to enjoy being brushed. She was special, Sarah said. Even then, there was something different about her. An intelligence, an awareness that went beyond what I'd seen in other rescued cubs. The mother bear had settled into what had become her usual position, lying down but alert, her head resting on her massive paws, but her eyes open and watchful. She looked tired, the stress of the past days showing in her posture, but also calm. Her cub was healing. The immediate danger had passed, and somehow she seemed to understand that soon they would return to their own world. The trust she had shown still amazed everyone who witnessed it. Around midnight, they removed the cub's IV for the final time. He protested slightly at the procedure, but settled quickly when his mother made soothing sounds. The wound was examined one last time, and everyone was pleased with how well it was healing. The stitches would dissolve on their own over time, and the scar would be the only evidence of this extraordinary encounter. Jessica gave him a final bottle of formula, which he drank eagerly, his strength clearly returning. "You know," Logan said quietly, "this changes things. How can we go back to thinking of wildlife as just animals after this?" She came to us for help. She remembered, she trusted, she waited. That's not just instinct, that's something more. Everyone nodded in agreement. They had witnessed something that challenged fundamental assumptions about the divide between human and animal consciousness. As the night deepened, they took turns keeping watch, though it was more about being present for these last hours than any medical necessity. The cub slept peacefully, occasionally making small sounds in his sleep that his mother would answer with gentle rumbles. It was like listening to a lullaby in a language older than words, a song of comfort that transcended species. The bond between mother and child was universal, and they had been privileged to witness it in its purest form. Ethan found himself thinking about the nature of memory and trust. This bear had carried the memory of human kindness for 10 years, through seasons of survival in the wild, through mating and motherhood, through all the challenges of life as an apex predator. And when her cub was injured, that memory had surfaced, strong enough to overcome every instinct that should have kept her away from humans. It was a kind of faith that most humans wouldn't be capable of. Around 3 in the morning, something beautiful happened. The cub, feeling much better, began to play. He batted at the edge of the blanket on the examination table, his movements still careful because of his injury, but playful, nonetheless. His mother watched with what could only be described as affection, occasionally making soft sounds that encouraged his play. It was a sign that he was truly recovering, that the crisis had passed, that life was returning to normal. Jessica couldn't help but laugh softly at the cub's antics. "He's just a baby," she said. "Even after everything, he's just a baby who wants to play." The normalcy of it, in such an extraordinary situation, was somehow perfect. It reminded them all that beneath the drama and impossibility of what had happened, this was simply about life, about healing, about the love between a mother and child. As dawn approached, they began final preparations for the release. Avery had arrived early to help coordinate, and she had brought a special transport cage that would make it safer to move the bears. The challenge would be getting them into it, but everyone hoped the mother's intelligence and trust would extend to this final step. They prepared the cage with blankets and some of the formula the cub had been drinking, trying to make it as comfortable as possible. The morning light was just beginning to touch the mountains when Ethan approached the mother bear for what would be the last time in the clinic. "It's time," he said softly. "Time for you both to go home." The bear looked at him with those remarkable eyes, and he could have sworn she understood. She stood slowly, stretching muscles that had been still for too long, and moved toward her cub. She sniffed him thoroughly, checking his wound, assessing his condition. Then she looked back at the humans who had saved her baby. What happened next would stay with everyone present for the rest of their lives. The bear moved toward Ethan, not aggressively, but deliberately. She stopped just a few feet away, closer than she had come to any of them except when entering the clinic. She looked directly into his eyes, held his gaze for a long moment, and then made a sound. Not a growl or a rumble, but something softer, almost like a sigh. It felt like thank you. It felt like goodbye. It felt like the acknowledgement of the bridge they had built between two worlds. Then she turned back to her cub, gently picked him up in her mouth, and walked toward the transport cage. She entered without hesitation, setting her cub down gently on the blankets, and lay down beside him. The trust she showed, even in this final act, was absolute. She understood they were helping her return home, and she accepted it with the same grace she had shown throughout this entire extraordinary experience. The drive up the mountain was quiet, everyone lost in their own thoughts about what they had witnessed. The sun was rising, painting the peaks in gold and pink, and the forest was waking up around them. When they reached the clearing Avery had suggested, they could see it was perfect. A meadow surrounded by tall pines, with a stream running through it, far from any roads or human habitation. They opened the cage, and for a moment, nothing happened. The mother bear looked out at the forest, then back at the humans who had saved her cub. She seemed to be memorizing them, storing their faces in whatever vast library of memory had allowed her to remember this place after 10 years. Then she picked up her cub once more and walked out of the cage. She set him down in the grass, and he stood on wobbly legs, looking around at his natural world with wonder. The mother bear walked a few yards into the meadow, then stopped and turned back. She looked at each of them in turn: Ethan, Jessica, Logan, Michael, Sarah, and Avery. It was a long look, full of something that transcended the barrier between species. Then she made that soft sound again, gathered her cub, and walked into the forest. They watched until the two bears disappeared into the shadows of the trees, returning to their world, carrying with them an extraordinary story of trust, healing, and the connections that bind all living things. As they drove back down the mountain, Jessica was crying quietly. "Will we ever see them again?" she asked. Ethan didn't answer because he didn't know. But he thought about the bear's intelligence, her memory, her remarkable ability to bridge two worlds when necessary. "Maybe," he said finally. "If she ever needs us again, she knows where to find us." They returned to the clinic to find the parking lot full of people who had heard about the release. There was applause as they got out of the vehicles, but Ethan barely heard it. He was thinking about the bear and her cub, now back in their wilderness home, carrying with them the memory of human kindness, just as the humans carried the memory of their trust. The treatment room seemed empty without the bear's presence. The corner where she had maintained her vigil for 3 days looked impossibly vacant. But there was something different about the space now, something that would never quite fade. It had been transformed from a simple medical room into a place where something magical had happened, where the impossible had become possible, where love had transcended every boundary. Over the following days and weeks, the story spread around the world. Scientists debated its implications for understanding animal cognition. Philosophers discussed what it meant about the nature of consciousness and emotion. But for those who had been there, who had witnessed the bear's vigil, it was simpler than all that. It was about love, it was about trust. It was about the connections that exist between all living things, connections that we too often forget in our separate worlds. The clinic returned to its normal routine, treating dogs and cats and the occasional injured bird. But everyone who had been present during those 3 extraordinary days was changed. They moved through their work with a different awareness, a knowledge that the animals they treated were capable of far more than most people imagined. They had seen behind the veil that separates human from animal, and what they had found there was not so different from themselves. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, Ethan would stand at the glass door where it had all begun and look out at the forest. He would think about the bear and her cub, hoping they were well, hoping the cub's wound had fully healed, hoping they were living their wild lives successfully. And sometimes, just sometimes, he thought he could feel something out there in the darkness. Not a presence exactly, but a connection, a thread of understanding that linked him to a mother bear who had trusted him with everything. The mystery of the bear's extraordinary behavior had captivated everyone in Cedar Ridge, but it was Jessica Brooks who couldn't let it go. 3 weeks had passed since they'd released the mother and her cub back into the wilderness, and while the clinic had returned to its normal routine of treating domestic pets, something nagged at her constantly. The bear had known exactly where to come for help, had walked directly to their clinic door with the confidence of someone returning to a familiar place. It wasn't just luck or coincidence. There had to be more to the story, and Jessica was determined to find it. She started spending her lunch breaks in the clinic's archive room, a dusty space filled with boxes of old records that no one had properly organized in years. The files were a mess, sorted neither by date nor alphabetically, just stacked in boxes that had been shoved onto shelves whenever someone had time. Jessica methodically went through each box, looking for any record of bears being treated at the clinic. She found several cases over the years, mostly cubs that had been orphaned or injured, brought in by wildlife officers or concerned citizens. But none of them seemed to match the mother bear they had just treated. The scar above her eye was distinctive, and Jessica was looking for any record that mentioned a similar injury. It was Ethan who remembered something his predecessor, Dr. Sarah Winters, had said during her visit. She had mentioned keeping personal journals about special cases, notebooks that weren't part of the official clinic records. Sarah had been meticulous about documenting her experiences with wildlife, believing that every encounter taught valuable lessons that might help future veterinarians. Ethan called Sarah and asked about these journals, and she confirmed that she had indeed kept detailed notes, especially about the more unusual cases. She still had them at her house, stored in her home office, and she invited Jessica and Ethan to come look through them. Sarah's house was a cozy cabin about an hour's drive up the mountain, surrounded by tall pines and overlooking a stunning valley. She greeted them warmly, clearly excited to share her records with people who would appreciate them. Her office was lined with bookshelves, and she pulled down several leather-bound journals, their pages yellowed with age. "I started keeping these when I first opened the clinic," she explained, running her fingers over the worn covers. "Every special case, every unusual animal, every lesson learned. It's all here." She opened one journal to a page dated over 10 years ago, and there it was, written in Sarah's neat handwriting, the story of a small bear cub with a distinctive injury above her left eye. The entry was dated October the 15th, almost exactly 10 years before the recent events. Sarah had written extensively about finding the cub by the roadside, severely injured and barely alive. A driver had called the clinic after seeing the cub get struck by a vehicle, and Sarah had rushed to the scene. The cub's mother was nowhere to be found, likely killed earlier, leaving the baby orphaned and vulnerable. The injury above her eye had been severe, a deep gash that Sarah had carefully sutured, knowing it would leave a permanent scar. But it was the next part of the journal entry that made Jessica's breath catch. Sarah had written about the cub's remarkable intelligence, how she seemed to understand that the humans were helping her, how she would watch everything with unusual attention and awareness. "She was special from the start," Sarah said, reading over their shoulders. "Most injured wild animals are either aggressive or completely shut down from fear. But this little one was different. She observed everything we did, learned our routines, seemed to understand that the syringes meant medicine, not harm. I've treated hundreds of wild animals over my career, but I've never encountered that level of awareness in such a young cub." The journal went on to describe weeks of rehabilitation, with the cub gradually gaining strength and confidence. Sarah had written about how the cub would watch her prepare medications, how she seemed to recognize different staff members, how she would make specific sounds when she wanted food versus when she wanted comfort. There were photographs tucked between the pages, slightly faded but still clear. The cub looked so small and vulnerable, her injured eye swollen shut, her little body thin from malnutrition. But in later photos she looked healthier, playful even, batting at toys Sarah had provided for enrichment. In one particularly touching photo, the cub was curled up sleeping in a blanket, looking peaceful and safe. It was hard to reconcile this tiny, vulnerable creature with the massive, powerful mother bear who had stood in their clinic just weeks ago, but the scar above the eye was unmistakable. This was definitely her. Sarah turned to another entry, this one describing the cub's release. It had been a difficult decision, as the cub had become somewhat habituated to humans during her recovery. But Sarah had worked hard to maintain the cub's wild instincts, feeding her natural foods, limiting human contact as she got stronger, preparing her for life in the forest. The release had taken place in early December, when the cub was strong enough to survive on her own, but before the harshest winter weather set in. Sarah had chosen a location where other bears had been successfully released, an area with good food sources and suitable habitat. "I worried about her constantly after the release," Sarah admitted, closing the journal. "Wondered if I'd done the right thing, if she would survive the winter, if she would remember to fear humans appropriately. but I also hoped that maybe she would remember that not all humans were dangerous, that some could be trusted if she ever truly needed help again. Sarah's eyes were misty as she looked at them. I never imagined she would actually come back, especially not after so many years. But she remembered. She remembered this place as somewhere safe, somewhere she could turn to when her own baby was in danger. The revelation added layers of meaning to what had already been an extraordinary event. This wasn't just a random bear seeking help. This was a bear returning to a place of remembered safety, carrying a decade of memory and trust. Jessica found herself thinking about the nature of memory itself, how experiences shape us in ways we don't always understand. This bear had carried the imprint of human kindness through years of wild living, and when faced with her cub's life-threatening injury, that memory had surfaced with crystal clarity. Logan, who had initially been the most skeptical about keeping the bears in the clinic, was deeply affected by this discovery. He had always prided himself on being scientific and rational, but this story challenged his assumptions about animal cognition and memory. 10 years, he kept saying, shaking his head in wonder. She remembered after 10 years. Do you understand what this means for our understanding of bear intelligence, of animal consciousness in general? He began researching similar cases, finding a few scattered reports of animals returning to places of previous care, but nothing on this scale, nothing with this level of deliberate trust. The story took on new dimensions as they pieced together more details. Sarah's journals revealed that during the cub's recovery, she had developed a particular routine. Every morning, she would enter the recovery room at exactly 7 o'clock, check the cub's wound, administer medications, and provide food. The cub had learned this schedule and would be waiting, alert and ready, when Sarah arrived. It was remarkably similar to how the adult bear had behaved in the clinic, settling into a routine, understanding the rhythm of care. The parallels were unmistakable and profound. Avery Johnson, the wildlife biologist, was fascinated by the implications. She began working on a paper about the incident, focusing on the evidence for long-term memory and complex decision-making in bears. This isn't just about memory, she explained to the veterinary team. It's about risk assessment, problem-solving, and trust. That bear had to weigh the danger of approaching humans against the need to save her cub. She had to remember not just the place, but the concept that this was a place of healing. That level of abstract thinking is something we typically only attribute to humans and maybe a few other highly intelligent species. The local community had embraced the story completely. Children drew pictures of the bear and her cub, which were displayed in the library and community center. The local school invited Ethan and Jessica to speak about their experience, and they found themselves in a classroom full of wide-eyed kids, all eager to hear about the brave mother bear. One little girl asked if the bear would come back again, and Jessica found herself hoping that if she did, it would be just to visit, not because of another emergency. Michael Hayes had been inspired to start a wildlife education program, using the bear's story as a centerpiece to teach about coexistence with wildlife and the importance of compassion across species boundaries. He partnered with local schools and community groups, sharing not just the dramatic story, but the deeper lessons about animal intelligence, memory, and emotion. The program was incredibly popular, with people driving from neighboring towns to attend his presentations. As autumn progressed into winter, the veterinary team often found themselves thinking about the bears. Were they preparing for hibernation? Had the cub's wound fully healed? Had they found a good den site? These questions couldn't be answered, but the wondering itself felt like a continuation of the connection that had been forged during those 3 extraordinary days. Sometimes, when treating a particularly difficult case, one of them would say, remember the bear, and it would remind them all that anything was possible, that connections could be made across seemingly impossible divides. Sarah Winters became a regular visitor to the clinic again, drawn back by the experience of seeing her former patient return. She would often sit in the treatment room, in the corner where the mother bear had maintained her vigil, and tell stories about other remarkable animals she had treated over her long career. But she always came back to the bear cub, to the special quality she had sensed in her from the beginning. "I think some animals are just different," she would say. "More aware, more conscious, more capable of bridging the gap between their world and ours. That bear was one of them." The discovery of the bear's history also led to a review of the clinic's wildlife treatment protocols. They realized that every animal they treated and released back into the wild carried with them an experience of human interaction that could shape their future behavior. This responsibility weighed on them, but it also inspired them to be even more thoughtful and compassionate in their care. They began keeping more detailed records, including behavioral observations that might help future veterinarians understand the individual personalities and capabilities of their wild patients. Jessica started a blog about the experience, sharing not just the dramatic story, but the day-to-day observations that had made it so profound. She wrote about the way the mother bear had communicated with her cub, the subtle body language that showed trust building over time, the moment of goodbye that had felt so deliberate and meaningful. The blog attracted readers from around the world, people hungry for stories that showed the possibility of connection and understanding between humans and wildlife. One particularly moving entry described the morning they had removed the cub's IV for the last time. Jessica wrote about how the mother had watched intently, how she had made soft sounds to comfort her cub during the procedure, how she had seemed to understand that this was the final step before going home. "In that moment," Jessica wrote, "I wasn't looking at a wild animal. I was looking at a mother who loved her child, who had risked everything to save him, who trusted strangers with her most precious possession. The boundaries we draw between human and animal, between wild and civilized, seemed not just arbitrary but absurd." The national media attention had eventually died down, but the impact on the local community remained strong. The clinic had become something of a pilgrimage site for people interested in wildlife and human-animal connections. They would come to see the treatment room where it had happened, to stand where the bear had stood, to imagine the extraordinary scene that had unfolded there. Ethan had mixed feelings about this attention, but he understood that people needed to see and touch places where remarkable things had happened, where the impossible had become possible. Logan had been corresponding with researchers from several universities who were interested in studying the case. They wanted to examine the cognitive implications, the neurological basis for such long-term memory in bears, the evolutionary advantages of being able to remember and trust specific locations, and perhaps even specific individuals across years of separation. While Logan engaged with the scientific aspects, he never lost sight of the emotional truth at the heart of the story. A mother's love had transcended every boundary. As winter settled over the mountains, bringing snow and cold winds, the clinic continued its work. But everyone who had been present during the bear's visit carried the experience with them. It influenced how they approached their work, how they thought about the animals in their care, how they understood the responsibilities and possibilities of their profession. They had been given a gift, a glimpse into something larger than their everyday experience, and they were determined to honor it. One snowy evening, Ethan was closing up the clinic when he noticed tracks in the fresh snow outside the door. They were bear tracks, large ones, with a smaller set beside them. His heart raced as he followed them with his flashlight. The tracks came from the forest, approached the clinic door, paused there for what must have been several minutes based on the disturbance in the snow, and then headed back into the woods. There was no way to be certain, but Ethan chose to believe it was them, that the mother and her fully healed cub had come by to check on the place that had saved them, to remind themselves that it was still there, still a beacon of hope if ever needed again. He didn't tell the others about the tracks right away, holding the knowledge close like a secret gift. But the next morning, when Jessica arrived early and saw them too, her eyes filled with tears of joy. "They're okay," she whispered. "They came to show us they're okay." Whether that was true or just wishful thinking didn't matter. The possibility was enough. The idea that the connection forged during those 3 days continued to exist, invisible but real, linking their worlds in ways that would never fully be understood, but would always be treasured. The weeks turned to months, and while there were no more confirmed sightings of the bears, their presence was felt in other ways. The clinic received donations from people touched by the story, money that was used to improve their wildlife treatment capabilities. They built a specialized recovery area for wild animals, designed with input from Sarah Winters and Avery Johnson, a space that could safely house injured wildlife while maintaining the boundaries necessary for successful release. They named it the Hope Recovery Center, after the hope that had brought a desperate mother to their door, and the hope she had inspired in everyone who heard her story. Local artists created sculptures and paintings inspired by the event, and one particularly beautiful piece was installed in the town square. It showed a bear and her cub approaching a door, with human hands extended in welcome. The plaque read simply, "Trust transcends boundaries." It became a gathering place, somewhere people would stop to remember that remarkable October when the impossible had happened in their small mountain town. Children would run their hands over the bronze bears, and parents would tell them the story again, keeping it alive for new generations. The impact extended beyond Cedar Ridge. Wildlife rehabilitation centers across the country reported increased interest and support, with many people citing the bear story as their inspiration for getting involved. Veterinary schools added the case to their curricula, using it to teach not just about wildlife medicine, but about the importance of remaining open to possibilities that challenge conventional wisdom. The story became a touchstone for discussions about animal consciousness, intelligence, and the potential for connection across species boundaries. For Ethan, the experience had fundamentally changed his practice of veterinary medicine. He found himself spending more time, observing his patients, looking for signs of the intelligence and awareness he now knew existed. He became known for his ability to calm frightened animals, to establish trust even with the most aggressive or fearful patients. When asked about his approach, he would simply say, "I learned from a bear that trust can transcend any boundary if we're willing to see beyond our assumptions." Jessica had been accepted into a veterinary program, inspired by her experience to become a doctor herself. In her application essay, she wrote about the 3 days that had changed her life, about watching a wild mother trust humans with her injured child, about the responsibility that comes with being worthy of such trust. "That bear taught me that veterinary medicine isn't just about medical knowledge," she wrote. "It's about recognizing the consciousness in every creature, respecting their capacity for emotion and memory, and honoring the trust they place in us when they're at their most vulnerable." The story also sparked important conversations about human-wildlife coexistence. As development continued to encroach on wild spaces, incidents of human-wildlife conflict were increasing. But the bear's story offered a different narrative, one of possible harmony and mutual aid. Communities began implementing new policies based on coexistence rather than control, creating wildlife corridors, establishing protocols for helping injured animals, and educating residents about living alongside their wild neighbors. One day, nearly a year after the original incident, A package arrived at the clinic addressed to Ethan. Inside was a research paper from a team of cognitive scientists who had been studying the case. They had analyzed all available evidence and concluded that the bear's behavior represented one of the most complex examples of animal memory, planning, and trust ever documented. But it was the handwritten note attached to the paper that moved Ethan most. It was from one of the researchers who wrote, "Science can describe what happened, but it cannot capture the magic of it. Thank you for having the courage to open that door." As Ethan stood in the treatment room holding the letter, he thought about courage. It had taken courage for him to open the door to a wild bear, yes, but it had taken far more courage for the bear to walk through it. She had overcome millions of years of evolution that told her to avoid humans, had trusted her deepest instinct as a mother over every other instinct, had placed her faith in a memory of kindness from a decade past. That was the real courage, and it humbled him every time he thought about it. The approaching winter brought news from Avery Johnson, who had been conducting field research in the area where the bears had been released. She had found evidence of their presence, tracks, scat, marking trees that suggested a healthy, active bear family. Even more excitingly, she had captured trail camera footage of what appeared to be the same mother and cub, now much larger and fully healed, foraging together in a meadow. The cub's scar was barely visible, just a line in his fur, but his mother's distinctive mark above her eye was clear. They looked healthy, strong, and completely at home in their wild world. Avery brought the footage to the clinic and everyone gathered to watch it on her laptop. There they were, the bears who had transformed their understanding of what was possible between humans and wildlife. The mother was teaching her cub to dig for roots, showing him how to turn over logs to find insects, all the normal behaviors of wild bears living their proper lives. But at one point in the footage, the mother stopped and looked directly at the camera, holding its gaze for a long moment. It was probably just curiosity about the device, but to everyone watching, it felt like acknowledgement, like she knew somehow that they would see this, that they would know she and her cub were thriving. "She's teaching him everything he needs to know," Avery explained, pointing out various behaviors in the footage, including, perhaps, that there's a place where help can be found if it's ever truly needed. That knowledge is part of his inheritance now, passed down from mother to child. The thought was both beautiful and profound. The cub would grow up knowing, on some level, that not all humans were threats, that there existed a place of healing and kindness. Whether he would ever need to use that knowledge was impossible to say, but it was there, woven into his understanding of the world. As the seasons cycled and another autumn approached, marking 2 years since the extraordinary events, the clinic organized a memorial evening. Not a memorial in the sense of loss, but a celebration of the connection that had been forged and the lessons that had been learned. The community gathered to share their memories, to look at photographs and videos from those 3 days, to reflect on how the experience had changed them. Children who had been inspired by the story shared drawings and stories they had written. Local musicians performed songs composed about the brave mother bear. It was an evening of gratitude for having witnessed something truly remarkable. Sarah Winters gave a speech that night that captured what many were feeling. "In my 40 years of working with animals," she said, "I've learned that they have so much to teach us if we're willing to listen. But that bear taught us the biggest lesson of all, that love knows no boundaries, that trust can bridge any gap, and that kindness, once given, is never forgotten. She carried the memory of compassion for 10 years and returned it to us magnified beyond measure. We are all better for having known her, even briefly." The evening ended with a moment of silence, everyone standing outside the clinic, looking toward the dark forest where the bears now lived. Somewhere out there, a mother and her grown cub were living their wild lives, carrying with them the memory of a time when two worlds had touched. And here, in this small mountain town, the humans who had been part of that touching carried their own memories, their own transformation. The silence was full of gratitude, wonder, and hope that such connections were possible, that the walls between human and nature were not as solid as they seemed. As people began to leave, Ethan noticed a young boy standing at the glass door of the clinic, his small hand pressed against it, looking out at the forest with intense concentration. When Ethan asked what he was doing, the boy replied, "I'm telling the bears thank you. My mom says they might hear it in their hearts." Ethan put his hand on the boy's shoulder, thinking that perhaps the child understood something that adults sometimes forgot, that connections of the heart transcend physical distance, that love and gratitude have their own ways of traveling. The story of the bear who refused to leave her cub's side had become legend in Cedar Ridge, but it was a living legend, one that continued to influence and inspire. Every injured animal brought to the clinic was treated with extra care, with the knowledge that they too were someone's baby, someone's precious family member. Every release back into the wild was conducted with ceremony and respect, understanding that these creatures would carry their experience with them, possibly for years. New staff members at the clinic were told the story as part of their orientation, not just as an interesting anecdote, but as a fundamental lesson about the nature of their work. They were shown the corner where the mother had kept her vigil, the examination table where the cub had been treated, the door through which Trust had walked. They were taught that veterinary medicine was not just about healing bodies, but about honoring the consciousness and emotional lives of their patients. The research inspired by the incident continued to yield insights. Studies on bear cognition, memory, and problem-solving were revealing capabilities that had been previously unknown or dismissed. The scientific community was slowly accepting what the people of Cedar Ridge had learned firsthand, that animals were far more complex, aware, and capable than traditionally believed. The bear's story had become a catalyst for a shift in understanding, a crack in the wall that had separated human from animal consciousness. But beyond all the scientific and philosophical implications, the story remained, at its heart, a simple one. A mother had loved her child enough to overcome every barrier to save him. She had remembered kindness and trusted in it when she needed it most. And humans had risen to meet that trust, had opened their doors and hearts to help. It was a story as old as compassion itself, but made new and remarkable by the species boundary it had crossed. As the second winter since the incident began to settle over the mountains, Ethan often found himself standing in the treatment room, remembering. The space had returned to its normal function, treating the usual array of domestic pets and occasional wildlife. But something of that October magic lingered, a sense that extraordinary things were possible, that connections could be made across any divide if there was enough love, enough trust, enough courage to reach across the gap. One evening, as snow began to fall softly outside, Ethan was preparing to close the clinic when he heard a sound at the door. His heart leaped, wondering if perhaps. But when he looked, there was no bear, just the wind moving through the trees. Still, he stood there for a moment, looking out at the forest, sending a silent message of continued goodwill to the bears wherever they were. "Be safe," he whispered. "Be well. And know that you're always welcome here." The story had no real ending, because the connection it had created continued. Every day, in small ways and large, the impact of those 3 days rippled outward. In the increased compassion shown to animals, in the wonder of children hearing the story for the first time, in the research that continued to reveal the depths of animal consciousness, in the quiet moments when someone would remember and be moved again by the courage of a mother's love. Jessica, now in her second year of veterinary school, kept a photo from that October on her desk. It showed the mother bear in her corner, watching over her cub, the very picture of devoted love. When the studies got hard, when she questioned whether she could make it through, she would look at that photo and remember. If a wild bear could trust humans with her most precious possession, if that level of connection was possible, then anything was possible. The photo reminded her why she had chosen this path, what kind of veterinarian she wanted to become. The Hope Recovery Center had treated dozens of injured wildlife in its first year of operation, each case handled with the extra care and respect that the bear's story had inspired. Some of the releases had been witnessed by the same crowds who had gathered for the original bear story, people who now understood that every release was a victory, every healed animal a testament to the possibility of compassion across species lines. The center had become a symbol of the community's commitment to coexistence with their wild neighbors. One particularly moving case involved an injured fox that had been brought in by a family who had found it by the roadside. The fox was treated and released near where it had been found, and weeks later the family reported seeing it regularly in their yard, healthy and thriving. The children insisted that the fox remembered them, that it would pause and look at them before disappearing into the underbrush. Whether this was true or wishful thinking didn't matter. What mattered was that the children were growing up with an understanding of animals as individuals worthy of help and respect. The ripple effects extended even further. A documentary filmmaker had contacted the clinic about creating a full-length film about the incident, combining interviews with the veterinary staff, the scientific analysis of the bear's behavior, and broader themes about human-wildlife relationships. The film, when released, would reach audiences worldwide, spreading the message of hope and connection that the bear had brought to their small mountain town. But even without the film, the story had already traveled far, inspiring similar acts of compassion and trust in places the people of Cedar Ridge would never know about. As spring arrived once again, bringing new life to the mountains, there were reports of bear sightings in the area. A mother with 2 cubs this time, one older and one younger. Some people insisted it was the same bear, now with a new cub as well as her recovered son. Others said it was impossible to know for sure. But Ethan, when he heard the reports, allowed himself to believe it was her, that she had continued to thrive, to raise her family, to live her wild life while carrying the memory of their brief, profound connection. The clinic had installed a small plaque by the door, where the bear had first appeared that October night. It read, "At this place, trust transcended fear, love overcame boundaries, and 2 worlds touched in compassion. October 2023, forever." Visitors would often pause to read it, to touch it gently, to imagine the scene that had unfolded there. For the people of Cedar Ridge, it had become a sacred spot, a reminder of what was possible when hearts opened to the unexpected. The story had taught them all that the lines humans drew between themselves and the natural world were artificial, that consciousness and emotion and love existed throughout the living world in forms we were only beginning to understand. The bear had been a teacher, showing them that animals were not just biological machines operating on instinct, but beings with memory, emotion, and the capacity for trust that could span years and species. As Ethan reflected on everything that had happened, he realized that the bear had given them a gift greater than just an amazing story. She had given them a new way of seeing the world, a lens of connection rather than separation, of possibility rather than limitation. She had shown them that kindness given was never wasted, that it could return in the most unexpected ways, magnified and transformed. She had proven that love was the universal language, understood across every boundary humans could imagine. The sun was setting on another day at the Cedar Ridge Veterinary Clinic, painting the mountains in shades of gold and purple. Inside, the staff was finishing up their work, treating the various animals that had come through their doors. Each patient was handled with care and respect, with the understanding that they were all individuals deserving of compassion. The bear's influence was felt in every interaction, a constant reminder of the trust that had been placed in them and the responsibility to be worthy of it. Outside, the forest was alive with the sounds of evening, birds calling, insects humming, the rustle of creatures moving through the underbrush. Somewhere out there, bears were living their lives, including perhaps a mother and her cubs who carried a special knowledge about a place where help could be found. The connection between the clinic and the forest, between human and wild, had been forever changed by 3 days in October, when a desperate mother had knocked on their door and asked for help. As the last light faded from the sky, Ethan stood once more at the door where it had all begun. He thought about the journey that had started with terror at seeing a wild bear approach, had moved through wonder at her trust, and had culminated in a profound understanding of the connections that bind all living things. The bear had been gone for over a year now, living her wild life, but her presence was still felt every day in the way they approached their work, in the way they understood their place in the larger web of life. "Thank you," he whispered to the darkness, to the forest, to wherever she might be. "Thank you for trusting us. Thank you for teaching us. Thank you for showing us that love knows no boundaries." The words were carried away on the mountain wind, perhaps reaching ears that would understand them, perhaps simply joining the eternal conversation between human and nature that the bear had made so viscerally real. The story would continue to be told, growing and changing with each telling, becoming part of the mythology of the place. But for those who had lived it, who had stood in the presence of that magnificent mother bear and witnessed her love for her cub, it would always be more than just a story. It would be a transformation, a moment when the impossible became possible, when trust bridged an ancient divide, when love proved itself more powerful than fear. And in the cycles of seasons that followed, as cubs were born and raised, as the forest continued its eternal rhythms, the memory of that October would persist. In the clinic, where healing happened every day. In the forest, where a mother bear had taught her cub about a place of safety. In the hearts of everyone who had witnessed or heard about those 3 extraordinary days. The bear who refused to leave her cub had left something else instead, a legacy of connection, trust, and the endless possibility of compassion across all boundaries. The mother bear's story had become part of the fabric of Cedar Ridge, woven into its identity as surely as the mountains that surrounded it. Children grew up knowing that they lived in the place where the bear had come for help, where trust had triumphed over fear. They carried this knowledge with them, a seed of understanding about the deeper connections that existed in the world. Some would become veterinarians or wildlife biologists, inspired by the story. Others would simply move through their lives with a greater awareness of the consciousness that existed in all living things. The research continued, with scientists finding more examples of complex cognition and emotional capacity in bears and other wildlife. Each discovery felt like a validation of what they had witnessed in Cedar Ridge, another piece of evidence that animals were far more than humans had traditionally believed. The bear's story had become a cornerstone case study, referenced in papers and presentations, used to argue for better treatment of wildlife, for more thoughtful coexistence strategies, for a fundamental rethinking of the human-animal relationship. But beyond all the academic and philosophical implications, the story remained most powerful in its simplicity. A mother had loved her child. She had sought help from an unlikely source. That help had been given freely and with respect. Trust had been honored. Lives had been saved. Hearts had been changed. It was a story that needed no embellishment, no dramatization. The simple facts of what had happened were profound enough to move anyone who heard them.